There is a moment most people never forget. You find yourself standing in a room full of people you've known for years, coworkers, old friends, maybe even family, and something feels slightly off. Not dramatically wrong, not in a way you can easily point to or explain, just subtly misaligned, like a song playing a fraction out of tune. Conversations feel rehearsed. Smiles arrive just a beat too late. Someone shifts the topic the moment you begin to speak. You go home and replay everything in your mind. You didn't do anything wrong. You didn't start conflict, didn't say anything offensive, didn't step on anyone's boundaries. And yet, the distance was real. The tension was real. That faint, persistent chill in the atmosphere was completely real. What no one tells you about that experience is this: it wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't your imagination. What you sensed is one of the oldest and most consistent patterns in human psychology, a pattern that Carl Jung spent decades studying, writing about, and warning people of. Once you understand what's truly driving it, the confusion begins to fade. Not because things suddenly become easier, but because you finally stop blaming yourself for something that was never about you. Most of us grow up with a simple idea of why people clash. Someone says something hurtful, someone breaks trust, someone lies or fails in an obvious way. Conflict appears to have a visible cause. But Jung looked beneath that surface-level explanation and uncovered something far more unsettling. He suggested that the most powerful and common form of social tension often has little to do with your actions. Instead, it is rooted in what your presence makes other people feel about themselves. To understand this, you have to grasp one of Jung's most essential ideas: the shadow. Every person carries two versions of themselves. There's the version they present to the world, composed, reasonable, and socially acceptable. Jung called this the persona, literally meaning mask. It is the identity we carefully build, maintain, and defend over time. Then there is everything else. The shadow is made up of the parts that didn't make it into that polished image. It holds the anger you suppressed because expressing it felt unsafe. It contains the envy you couldn't admit because it felt shameful. It includes the desire for recognition, the quiet insecurity, the fear of being insignificant, the small resentments, and the private doubts. The shadow isn't inherently evil. It is simply the collection of traits a person has rejected in order to preserve the version of themselves they prefer to show. The crucial insight Jung offered is that the shadow never disappears. You can ignore it, bury it, or cover it with layers of persona, but it remains. And when something or someone touches it, when your presence or behavior brushes against what another person has been avoiding within themselves, their psychological system reacts. That reaction is often defensive, and in many cases, it feels like hostility. There is an uncomfortable truth about becoming more aware. The more clearly you begin to see people, their patterns, their contradictions, the gap between what they say and what they actually mean, the more threatening your presence can become to those who are deeply attached to their persona. Not because you confront them, not because you expose anything directly, but because your presence alone introduces the possibility that you see beyond the surface. And that possibility is enough to trigger a defensive response. From their perspective, imagine spending years carefully managing how others perceive you. You project confidence even when you feel uncertain. You perform kindness while quietly keeping score. You say the right things at the right moments, making sure no one looks too closely. Then someone enters the room who isn't impressed by the performance, who doesn't engage in the same social theater, who simply observes with calm clarity. That person doesn't need to speak. Their presence alone feels like exposure. Jung described what follows as projection. Instead of examining their own discomfort, instead of asking why your presence unsettles them, the mind looks for an easier solution. It assigns the discomfort to you. Suddenly, you are labeled as arrogant, distant, judgmental, or strange. These accusations are not reflections of who you are. They are reflections of what your presence has stirred within them. Once projection takes hold, something important shifts. People stop responding to who you actually are. They begin reacting to the internal discomfort you unintentionally trigger. You could remain patient, kind, and consistent, and it still wouldn't change the outcome, because they are no longer seeing you clearly. They are reacting to the mirror your presence creates. This dynamic doesn't announce itself loudly. It appears in small, difficult-to-define moments that build over time. One of the most common ways it shows up is when you reflect something others have been avoiding. Perhaps you've started improving your habits, your health, your discipline, your emotional awareness. You're not preaching or showing off. You're simply living differently. Yet certain relationships begin to shift. Comments become subtly dismissive. Jokes carry a sharper edge. You're told you've changed, that you're too intense or too focused. What's really happening is that your growth has become a mirror. Your discipline highlights their avoidance. Your consistency contrasts with their excuses. You didn't intend to create that reflection, but it exists, and not everyone can tolerate what it reveals. So instead of addressing their discomfort internally, they redirect it toward you. Another way this pattern appears is when you represent something someone else gave up on. People rarely resent those who are struggling more than they are. Resentment usually moves upward toward those who embody a possibility they once believed in but abandoned. The colleague who follows through, the friend who leaves an unhealthy situation, the person who returns to pursue a long-delayed goal. These individuals don't attack anyone, yet their existence quietly challenges the choices others have made. When you embody a path someone else didn't take, you become inconvenient. It becomes easier for them to dismiss you as lucky, unrealistic, or out of touch than to confront the deeper discomfort of their own decisions. A more subtle shift happens when you stop needing approval. Many relationships are built on unspoken exchanges: validation, reassurance, influence. When you become more emotionally independent, when you stop over-explaining yourself or seeking constant validation, those dynamics begin to change. From your perspective, this is growth. From theirs, it can feel like distance or rejection. What has actually changed is the balance of influence. The emotional levers that once worked no longer do. Instead of recognizing this shift, the mind reframes it. You're seen as distant, detached, or superior. In reality, what they're experiencing is the loss of a certain level of control or influence they once had, even if they were never consciously aware of it. Unpredictability is another trigger. Social interactions often rely on expected responses. Push a certain button, get a predictable reaction. When you stop responding in familiar ways, when you don't react to guilt, don't chase approval after criticism, don't soften in response to flattery, the script breaks. You're not being aggressive or confrontational. You simply stop playing along. For someone used to those patterns, this is deeply unsettling. Your calm, non-reaction signals that you see the underlying dynamic, and people who rely on those patterns often feel exposed when they are quietly observed. Finally, there is the discomfort that arises when you refuse to maintain comfortable illusions. Every social group operates on unspoken agreements, things everyone pretends not to notice, narratives that keep the group stable. When you no longer participate in those shared illusions, even silently, it disrupts the balance. You don't have to confront or criticize anyone directly. Simply not reinforcing the illusion is enough. Your presence alone challenges what others have agreed, often unconsciously, to ignore. And for many people, that quiet disruption feels like a threat, even if they cannot clearly explain why. We don't usually talk about certain things. We act as if particular behaviors are normal. There is an unspoken agreement to ignore certain patterns that, if anyone pointed them out openly, would disrupt everything. These quiet agreements are not always driven by bad intent. In many cases, they are simply the easiest way to keep things smooth, the social glue that prevents tension from escalating. But they are still illusions, and keeping them alive depends on everyone playing along. The moment you stop playing along, everything shifts. When you choose not to laugh at something that isn't actually funny, when you refuse to agree with something you genuinely don't believe in, when you calmly point out a dynamic everyone else is pretending not to see, you become a problem. Not because you attacked anyone directly, but because you disrupted the agreement. And groups tend to protect their shared illusions with surprising intensity, often without even realizing it. Another shift happens when you begin to say no. For a long time, maybe you were easy to rely on, easy to reach, easy to overlook. You said yes when you meant no. You carried things you shouldn't have carried. You made yourself available to people who were rarely available to you. People appreciated it, but not in a deeply conscious way. What they really experienced was comfort. The comfort of knowing there was someone in their life whose boundaries were soft enough that they could behave however they wanted without consequences. Then something changes. You begin to draw lines. You step back from situations that cost you more than they gave. You say no, and you mean it. The people who benefited from your lack of boundaries, including some who genuinely cared about you, feel that shift as a loss. This isn't always about cruelty or manipulation. It's about adjustment. What follows is rarely expressed honestly. People don't say, "I preferred it when I could take take advantage of your flexibility. Instead, they say you've changed. They say you've become distant, difficult, or selfish. What they are actually reacting to is the end of a comfortable imbalance, the end of an arrangement that never had to be discussed because you never challenged it. Another layer appears when you start moving forward and the gap becomes visible. This is often the most difficult part to deal with because it involves people you truly care about. When you change in a meaningful way, not just on the surface, but in how you think, what you accept, and what you pursue, you naturally create distance between yourself and those who remain where they are. This distance is not created out of superiority or rejection. It simply reflects the fact that you are no longer in the same place you once were. But the people who haven't changed feel that difference. And the silent question it raises, why haven't I moved too, can be deeply uncomfortable. When a question feels too uncomfortable to answer honestly, the mind often redirects it. It turns inward discomfort into outward judgment. Your growth becomes interpreted as arrogance. Your changes are seen as disloyalty. Your evolving priorities feel like a rejection of the values others still hold. None of this is intentional on your part, yet it becomes the narrative others use to explain their feelings. What needs to be understood is that these reactions are not truly about you. They are about what your progress forces others to confront within themselves. And facing that internal discomfort is not easy. If you step back and look at these patterns together, a clear theme emerges. The resistance you encounter is not really a response to anything you have done wrong. It is a response to the pressure your presence creates. You are not causing problems by failing. You are creating discomfort by becoming more honest, more aware, more independent, more aligned with who you actually are. In a world where many people are quietly avoiding that level of self-examination, your direction stands out. Carl Jung described the deeper purpose of psychological growth as individuation, the process of becoming whole, integrating the parts of yourself you once avoided, letting go of roles that no longer fit, and moving toward a more authentic identity. This process is not common. It is not easy. It requires confronting aspects of yourself you would rather ignore, accepting parts of your past you might wish to forget, and continuing forward without relying on constant approval. But when someone genuinely engages in that process, it creates a noticeable effect on the people around them. Individuals who are becoming more integrated are difficult to control. They don't remain confined to expected roles. They don't depend on validation in the same way. They don't react predictably. And they often see through patterns that others depend on to maintain a sense of stability. This doesn't make them dangerous in a literal sense, but it can feel unsettling on a deeper psychological level. Your growth can unintentionally highlight what others have chosen not to pursue. Not in a confrontational way, but in a quiet, undeniable one. And that alone can be enough to create tension. Recognizing this pattern doesn't immediately make things easier. Understanding that someone's reaction is tied to their own internal struggle doesn't remove the sting of their behavior, but it does change how you respond to it. One of the most common reactions is the urge to fix the situation by shrinking yourself, to return to old patterns, to soften your edges, to become more agreeable so that others feel comfortable again. This response is natural because humans are wired for belonging, and the experience of being gradually pushed away is painful. However, reducing yourself does not resolve the underlying issue. The discomfort others feel is not caused by your behavior alone, but by what your behavior represents to them. Making yourself smaller might temporarily ease tension, but it does not address the deeper dynamic. Instead, some relationships will naturally change. Not every connection that worked in one phase of your life will continue to fit in another. This is not necessarily a failure. It can be a reflection of growth. It also becomes important to interpret reactions more carefully. Not all criticism should be dismissed. Some feedback comes from genuine care and deserves attention. But other reactions reveal something different, especially when they come from people who were comfortable only when you were more convenient to them. At the same time, you begin to notice something else. There are people who respond differently. The same qualities that unsettle some individuals draw others closer. Those who are also seeking growth often recognize something familiar in your direction. Where one person reacts with discomfort,